NES and Famicom libraries are pretty much like movies or books. You get so many different genres and tastes, and each time you dig deep dive into it, there's just so much about these hundreds of titles that you still discover to this very day and underappreciated over the years. Of course, you would have your usual suspects of those of NES titles with the likes of Mario's, Mega Man, Castlevania, Metroid, Zelda, and so on and so forth. But oftentimes you would also find yourself some of the B-movie types of titles that has interesting ideas and concept but did not execute it super well due to the developer's limitation with technical skills or budget even, or simply just flat out bad. Yet on the other category, you also got some of the hidden gems that's been only discovered through the cult following over the years in the age of the internet. And quite frankly, I'm not gonna repeat myself again as everyone else has already covered the trophy status of games over the past million times at this point. Though in recent years, with the revisiting of Moon Crystal and simultaneously working on this game's review project, I had yet another real pleasant surprise revisit. And this, it took me nearly 4 years. I am not kidding with you. It took me that long for this game to get over here.
Bring it over here!
Recapping briefly from my previous Moon Crystal video, in particular about the game itself, while this was a game that I didn't have much of a childhood experience, plus in many ways was a game I was heavily being critical and showcasing more of a frustrating side despite with its unique status of the game and its overall beautiful stylistic choice that the game was going for. This game that I'll be talking about today, on the other hand, is, well, a rather pleasant game on its own. It was a game that I actually played it a lot on the emulation scene back then that the powerful PC was the only thing I got to play some of the retro titles. Remember guys, I'm still Gen Z. Think of it as if Moon Crystal was like being introduced to the familiar acquaintances you barely talked to back then in elementary school days, properly for the first time in recent years, and found out this person has both the positive and negative aspect of their personality that I might or might not consider to be friends with. This game, on the other hand, is like revisiting your friends even after ages and still be like, these bastards are definitely my good old friends. So, who is that middle school friend I would like to introduce for my show and tell today then? Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is Metal Storm on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Fully titled as Kevinhwsohn Metal Stomp, translate as Gravity Trooper Metal Storm, is a side-scrolling action platformer developed by Tamtex and published by none other than Irem. Now, if you're not remember about Irem, okay, I'm sorry, I just had to Irem.
Huh? You bought me, but
If you're not familiar with Irem, even though they might not be a biggest giant on the gaming scene, especially with the likes of other third-party Nintendo licensee companies with the companies like Konami, Capcom, or Taito, they still had their own solid input, and in fact was one of the first Nintendo licensee developer during the Famicom and NES's debut, as well as inputting some of the great hits in the arcade scenes. They're the ones behind with the hits like Spartan X, known as Kung Fu on the North American title, which was a great game that was actually, believe it or not, based on the Japanese title of Jackie Chan film Wheels on Meals, but the game itself actually feels more like Bruce Lee's Game of Death, as well as inputting some of the other giants and cult hits of Joe and Mac, Hammer and Harry, Image Fight, Ninja Baseball Batman, what a great title, and of course, who could forget the amazing R-Type franchise. Tamtex, on the other hand, is a lesser-known developer that was actually a subsidiary of Irem. They are the ones who are responsible with developing a sequel to Spartan X2 on the Famicom, as well as with the likes of Hammer and Harry Ghost Building Company on Game Boy, Pa-Man on the Famicom, and sadly, they are the ones who are responsible for the notorious yet surprisingly succeeded But you're in luck because thankfully, their 1991 developed Famicom title, Metal Storm, not only comes across far from the lower quality of Deadly Towers, but it also comes down as one of the very solid side-scrolling action platformer that exceeds in graphically, stylistically, and overall being for the very good Famicom/NES game in general. Wait, there's one correction I have to make from the sentence I just made now. 1991 Famicom title. Well, of course, the game saw its release on the Japanese market on the Famicom, but this game was actually one of the rare scenarios where the game came out in the United States first on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and a year later on the Famicom. Quite unusual for the Japanese games to be made its debut in the US market first before the Japanese market. However, the version we'll be talking about is a re-release Famicom NES version. Okay, now that will scratch your head a little bit, but trust me, we will get into that sweet regional differences in just a second. But what did I mean with the re-release version? Well, this is where Retrobit comes in. Oh, and by the way, for real, this is not sponsored. Like 4 years later after its release we're talking about. Retrobit is one of the few companies that still produces some of the third-party products for the retro gaming consoles, from accessories, controllers, as well as their own lineup of Famicom system with the likes of Super Retro Trio Plus, and quite frankly disappointing NES Classic cash grab Super Retrocade plug-and-play console. Though one of the things that Retrobit has been eye-catching by many in recent years is their re-release of the previous retro game titles with their own actual cartridges, and Retrobit does indeed actually holds some of the license agreements with the big companies and titles, including the likes of Capcom, Data East, Technos, and of course, Irem. A couple of years ago, Retrobit was responsible for bringing a used-to-be Japanese exclusive Famicom title of Holy Diver to the NES, and even R-Type Multicard, which brought the very sought-after R-Type 3 to the general public. And much like these two Irem releases, Retrobit in 2019 strikes again with none other than re-release of the Metal Storm on the NES. And this isn't just an original Metal Storm on the NES from 1991, this is in fact was a re-release, the updated Japanese Famicom version. Think of it as like a director's cut of the game. When the limited edition was first announced, it had an option between a special box set with the full figurines, which many people like Stop Skeletons from Fighting or Happy Video Game Nerd, depending on the era, covered it before, and actually looks pretty cool with the figurines as well as the game itself, which by the way is actually one of the first people to brought this game live on his debut YouTube review, as well as being quoted on the box for the box set of the Metal Storm. Good for you, Derek. Yeah! And the other option was a standard complete in box version. which was the version I picked. Though the figurine box set was cool and all, since I wasn't really into collecting figurines, unless we're talking about I decided to go for the cheaper standard edition. Once I finally broke the sacred seal, and well, box alone is definitely in a solid quality. And unfortunately, I don't have an actual Metal Storm complete in box set, cause buying the original copy would be an insanity.
This is where I put it.
Original Metal Storm complete in box set.
If I had one!
I gotta say, the box seems faithful from the original box set release. Inside the box, you got the full colored manual that's in both English and Japanese, which is a nice touch. It's glossy with colorful and detailed instructions in multi-language. Bilingual, ladies and gentlemen. It's even more extra special to have a manual in any games in recent years, considering the fact that nowadays you don't even get the manual in modern. Then there's a full-size poster that depicts the Japanese Famicom box art, and of course, the main star, the game itself, coming in a very nice quality shell. Mine was a slick, sexy Twilight Black edition, which I'm very pleased with. Having said that though, all of this would mean nothing if the main dish that's served to you is not delicious, isn't it? Thankfully, hooking up the game itself, what you would see is the true unsung game that pushes the limit of the hardware furthermore. Plus, let's just say, this game kicks ass. This version of Metal Storm, as I've stated before, is a translated version of the original Famicom cut, with the updated cutscenes, which is a nice little addition since the original US version missed out on these cutscenes. The plot revolves around the year 2501. Planet Pluto's battle station of Cyberg becomes destroyed, the only planet that protected the Earth from the aliens, and now is destroying its solar system. In the midst of this, the M308 gunner, our main protagonist, goes on to the mission to save the solar system as well as to save the Earth from the mass destruction. A truly an epic cyberpunk tale, simply yet strong to begin with. Oh, and of course, there's a game itself. Since we're on the topic of the regional difference, the major difference is that the NES version excludes the detailed opening sequence, as well as some of the color palettes being different, where in the North American version, M308 has slightly reddish color, opposed to the Famicom version, where it's back to the original white and red figure. As well as some of the background palettes are different, accommodating to the color palette of the M308, as well as very minor boss battle and stage layout differences. But beyond that though, the core gameplay is almost identical, and either way, you would be getting some of the finest platforming experiences on the NES. Graphically speaking, it looks amazing for its early 90s NES and Famicom title, and it really pushes it through its limitation of Famicom's graphical capability for its time. Metal Storm uses the MMC3 chip, the same chip that was also used in the games like Super Mario Bros. 3 or Rockman/Mega Man games from 3rd installment all the way up to 6th. This easily enhances the graphical capability, especially when this game presents some of the fantastic looking scrolling effects on the background. As well as several animations, including M308 itself, showcases a very vibrant color scheme with detailed frames, much like how Moon Crystal plays out. As crazy as I may sound, even when you die, the explosion looks awesome. That's the beauty of this game, isn't it? But the mechanics and the controls are where this game really shines through. The main movements are responsive. M308 has at least 4 different directions that it can shoot the gun through, ranging from left, right, up, and even down while ducking and jumping in mid-air. It sort of has that contra vibe of elements included into right from the get-go, minus the diagonals. The main gimmick of this game is that you're able to manipulate the gravity when you choose to do so, mostly by pressing either up and A or down and A depending on the gravity. Funnily enough, the Retrobits release actually changes up a bit with the controls of the gravity manipulation. Now you have to press down and A for reversing the gravity to the ceiling, and up and A for changing the gravity back to normal. This is almost similar to Mega Man or Rockman 5's Gravity Man stage, or the reverse gravity switch from the Jetsons' Cogswell's Caper, albeit this game came out way before those two. And this, you can switch the gravity whenever you feel so. In general, the controls are nearly perfect, in my opinion, with both the movements and jumping are tight, yeah! The stages in general are also a strong point, in which it once again gradually increases the difficulty without throwing off players immediately. And for each stages, I found it to be a lot more creative as you progress through the game. Despite with its standard side-scrolling stage, the game also effectively staged it very well, that once again allowing the players to play around with the manipulation of gravity. And I gotta say, there's a good chunk of imagination going on throughout each stage. Most of the stages requires a lot of puzzle-solving elements at times, especially playing around with the gravity being a key part of the game. Though M308 suffers from one-hit kill initially, thankfully the game allows for more weapon upgrades as well as certain shields for the extra hit points. It definitely helps with going through the stages. And again, the stages in general, I found them to be thematic for each stages. Stage 1 comes down as a simple and lenient stage for the learning curve of the players. Stage 2 pushes it a bit further to test your skills to play around with the gravity of it. Stage 3, while lenient, yet increases the difficulty slightly by using the advantage of the MMC3's scrolling effect, where the background scrolls along with you each time M308 makes a movement from left to right, which can be a brain test to the limits. Stage 4, you're trapped into some sort of a boxy elevator thing that requires you to act quickly within the limited space, while it's avoiding major obstacles and enemies. Stage 5, you're back onto the lenient ground stage, except this time there are many of the laser beams shooting with each angle and one of it. And by far the most challenging, yet pretty exciting stage is level 6, where the ceiling and the floor is covered with laser barrier, while the platforms are moving vertically. Again, testing full limits with its fast reflexes. Honestly, it's a good amount of creativity of the level design that makes it so much fun to rise up for the challenge. It doesn't really have too much of the unfair so on and so forth level design, but rather tossing a good amount of heavy challenges each and now and then. Plus, it doesn't have a cryptic cheat elements that could lead to the death either, as again, the controls are extremely responsive. And even as for the hit detection, it's either one hit death or try it again, or M308 briefly becomes handicapped for 1 second. In other words, if you die, it's simply your fault and you just have to try it again to get it right. A good challenge that makes the people grow in process, and that's what makes this game very good. The boss fights in general have a respectable amount of both difficulty, yet not to the point where it would throw off the players once again. Stage 1 boss, boom, easy. Stage 2 boss consists of these laser blasting machines stuck on the wall, and you have to blast them with the gun a couple of times while simultaneously avoiding them. Those purple robot things on the wall, by the way, really reminds me of the final door from Super Mario Bros. 2. Stage 3 boss is the floating machines while it's avoiding the laser from both horizontal and vertical. Stage 4, you're trapped in the grid with 2 machines from the ceiling and the bottom shooting lasers at you. while trying to avoid this red machine zooming through these grids like some sort of DVD logo screen. Stage 5 is by far the coolest boss in my opinion. Really, I'm not even joking, where the machine only moves vertically while changing different sets of forms. The pattern of laser shooting gets different each time as it transforms its formation, and you have to react very quickly depending on the laser pattern. Honestly, it's pretty cool. Stage 6 boss is by far the hardest of the bunch. Both the ceiling and the floor are covered in laser barriers, which is fine and all, until you realize you have to use the actual boss as a main platform, which means you have to calculate the order of how you have to kill off the boss in order, otherwise you're screwed. A very mind reflex demanding boss stage, and it gets intense over and over. And the last but not least, stage 7 involves with none other than repeating the same 6 bosses once again, albeit each has its own ramp-up difficulties increased. Feels similar to those of Mega Man / Rockman games if you ask me to do so. Though I wouldn't have mind for some sort of original boss for the final round, but considering for the equal amount of challenge that this game tossed at me, I also don't have much of complaints for the final round either, as once you beat the game, you're given with the expert mode to go through, and if you're up for a challenge with the expert mode, go nuts on your own, as the expert mode does not joke around with the new enemy placement and more difficulties significantly added into each stages and boss battles, which in the long run makes it one of the toughest platforming experience, yet it still rocks overall. The final key difference between the NES and the Famicom version are the password system, which allows players to keep on track with continue codes with each stage. And thankfully, the blessing of the updated Japanese version is that they are also gracious enough to add 30 lives plus full weapon equipped password code in case of the game is tougher for you. The icing of the cake is that this game allows you to have multiple continues with checkpoints whenever you get a game over. Even better is that whenever you die, unless you get a complete game over, it lets you to still keep all the upgraded items. Now that is an encouraging generosity right there. Where is yours, Moon Crystal?
Emotional damage!
Though I can confidently say, whatever version you're playing this game with, the game is overall a satisfying experience to go through. With colorful and vibrant colors, a futuristic setup for the story, not to mention combining with the hardcore NES difficulty that gives trial and error, and on top of the near perfection of the controls that adds the interesting mechanics to play around with. And it rocks that this game got its well-deserved cult following over the years. Yet, it still baffles me as to why this game never saw its more recognition in the light of the day. I mean, it was one of the main games that was even featured in Nintendo Power cover. The only presumption I could take away from is the fact that even if NES was still popular, it was a transitioning period of Super Nintendo, even as for the baby step. Plus, a lot more well-known titles, much like Battletoads, Batman Return of the Joker, and of course, the similar running gunner, side-scrolling classic of 4th installment of Mega Man were equally hitting the scene. While this is just a speculation as why Metal Storm was overshadowed, but considering the fact that it has that similar concept of robotic protagonist up against evil robot plot has been stuck with Mega Man franchise at this point, yeah, I wouldn't blame people they might have picked for the latter. And it's a shame, because Metal Storm has its own originality and creativity that was put onto this game overall. Metal Storm is a clever game, and I was very delighted with revisiting on this magnitude of hidden gem. It's engaging, fun to play, and I can definitely see why many people would consider this a cult classic among the NES title. Only it should be the game where I can say without any shame that should be remembered and played more for being an underrated classic. And even though I'm 4 years much later after Retrobit's release, they were rad just to give this game a deserved spotlight once again. If you ever get your own chance to play this game in any shape or form, or even just to play it on the emulator, hey, that's no problem. But I just want to say, if you're into this, my friend, you're in one treat of a game as soon as you press that start button.